Alrighty, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Buck the System. I'm your host, David West. And once again, just like in the last episode, I want to apologize for how long it's been since I actually did an episode. I will have a lot more stuff coming up regularly very soon. I have a couple exciting, fun episodes that I've been working on putting together, but the last week and a half or two between work and trying to finalize a remodel that I'm doing on my house, a remodel that will hopefully help me make money. It's been pretty busy and I've had a hard time getting to this and I had to kind of prioritize some other things. So anyway, just a quick kind of fun short episode today. We're going to look at some really dumb stuff that Joe Biden said last week, right before the New Hampshire are they primaries or caucuses? I think New Hampshire's a primary. I forget. I'm not paying that much attention to it. So this was at some kind of town hall event in New Hampshire. Joe Biden, a man whose experience with firearms seems to simply revolve around getting shotguns and firing them mindlessly through doors, and not knowing what's on the other side. Very irresponsible advice from the Vice President of the United States. He has some things to say about guns, and most of them are predictably pretty stupid. So I'm just going to go through his, I think it's about 6 minutes or so at this town hall where he's talking about gun control after being asked a question by a very questionable resident of Iowa. And we're going to just kind of comment on it. So let's get this started here.
I don't know why I called on you. You've asked 20 questions already, but you're a good man. This guy, I won't tell you about him yet, but go ahead.
I'm from Iowa.
Is he though?
And I have follow Joe Biden vice president since 2007. And in 2008, I voted for President Obama. Last Tuesday, in Iowa, I voted for Joe Biden. And this is our future proven leader of the United States. And I have about 10 volunteers from Iowa to working for you in Salem today. And also that my question is that in the last 10 years, the U.S. Congress has not been effectively doing anything for gun control. I have two boys, graduate from Iowa high school and colleges. And I want to ask you that in your first 10 days, what kind of executive orders you want to do to have effectively gun control to make the school safety zones?
All right.
I hate to be the guy that rags on immigrants. I have no real problem with immigrants. Here in Southern Oregon, there are a lot of Mexican farmhands who probably hop the border without getting the government's permission, who I would much rather have as neighbors than all the liberals coming up here from the Bay Area because they realize they can sell their $2 million house and buy a $400,000 house up here and try to turn Southern Oregon into the Bay Area 2.0. I don't want those people as neighbors. I'd much rather have some Mexican Catholic with, half a dozen kids come be my neighbor. But when you are as much of a turd burglar as this Asian guy is, no. Go back to China and die of the coronavirus if you're going to be this stupid. I have no respect for people who move to an area and then try to just completely change what it's like there. If you're from a very anti-gun country and you decide that you want to immigrate to America, please don't try to take our guns. Be a cool immigrant. Be like my boy Sam from Iran.
From my cold, dead hands! This is the best country in the world. You don't believe it? You can go to Mexico. You can go to England. In England, you don't have First Amendment speech. You get arrested for saying the wrong thing. In Canada, you get arrested for the same wrong thing. We only have First Amendment because of our Second Amendment. It's called Second Amendment, people. It's not going anywhere.
That is what I'm talking about. I don't care how you get to the country, legally or illegally. Have an attitude like Sam. That guy's awesome. If you want to change things voluntarily, whatever. But if you're going to come legislate and try to use force against me and people that actually are from here and have lived here forever, get out of here. Go back to China.
By the way, he's a professor and he has an awful lot of students. And I And I didn't want you, that's not a setup. I didn't pick him to stand up and ask the question, but thank you for it's a good question though. But it's, what do I do about safety in schools and rational gun policy?
No, Joe, that's not actually what the question was. The question was,
In your first 10 days, what kind of executive orders you want to do to have effectively gun control to make the school safety zones?
so this guy is asking what you're going to do in your first 10 days of president to utilize executive orders to institute gun control, which is terrifying. I hate that. That's a horrifying prospect. You shouldn't do anything at all with your executive order powers in regards to gun control. I mean, unless you want to, try to, I don't know if you could do this as an executive order, but try to pardon everyone who's ever been convicted of a nonviolent, completely arbitrary, victimless gun crime. I'd be all in favor of that. But no, what this guy's asking is way scarier and more authoritarian. That's why, I'm like, dude, get out of here. Go back to China. Like, I have no problem with people moving to the country. I don't even think you should need the government's permission to move to the country. You shouldn't need the government's permission to cross an imaginary line, just like you shouldn't need the government's permission to buy and carry whatever gun you want. The only borders that I think should exist are private property borders. I don't really like government borders at all. So I don't care that people want to move somewhere new. I've moved several times in my life, and that's fine. But when you're this much of an authoritarian, you're just going to come here and try to turn America into a communist hellhole like China? No, get out of here. So that's not the question, Joe.
Well, look, folks, I'm going to say something. Everybody has ideas about what to do about a rational gun policy. There is a Second Amendment, and you do have a right to bear arms, but not an unlimited right. No amendment is absolute.
I don't know. Shall not be infringed seems pretty clear, if you ask me.
I own a 20-gauge shotgun. I own a 12-gauge shotgun. I'll answer your question in a minute, sir. I own a 20-gauge and a 10-gauge shotgun. I just skeet shoot. I don't even hunt. My sons are hunter. They bird hunt.
Did you catch that where Joe Biden says he owns a 20-gauge and a 12-gauge, and then he says he owns a 20-gauge and a 10-gauge? A 10-gauge shotgun is a real thing. They're fairly rare. You don't see them very often. I don't think I've ever handled a 10-gauge shotgun in my life. But I would doubt that someone as clearly unversed in firearms as Joe Biden has either. But it cracks you up. This isn't the first time he's done this. He's done this several other times.
I own a 20-gauge and a 12-gauge shotgun.
He seems to be constantly forgetting what kind of shotgun he owns, which I don't know if that speaks to his senility or if he doesn't necessarily own shotguns. I'm sure Biden owns a gun or two. He certainly has the money to do it, but he's obviously not shooting very often if he doesn't know what they are. So it kind of cracks me up.
We protect, by the way, geese crossing the international boundary more than we do people. You only have three shells in your shotgun if you're going goose hunting. Okay, but you can have 100 rounds in a magazine that you can buy today.
Yeah, but you can't murder anyone, Joe. That's illegal. Here we're starting to get into the actual meat of the stupidity here. This is a really common argument that liberals make. They'll say things like, wow, children aren't as protected as geese are. Well, here's the problem with that. There's a law that says you can't take more than you can't have more than 3 rounds while you're shotgun hunting for birds. It's generally the way the laws work. But you can't shoot children at all. So I don't know how they make this argument in good faith. I don't know if this is like one of those things where sneaky politicians make this argument because they know that it's good rhetoric for retards, or if it's one of those things where everyone actually making this argument is just a retard themselves. I don't know how you can make this argument and not see the flaws in it. It's real stupid. And let me tell you what, you can have more rounds in a shotgun. you just aren't supposed to have more hunting. I've taken the plugs out of shotguns before because I wasn't doing any bird hunting with them, so I just wanted to have my full tube to hold 4 or 5 rounds instead of just 2 additional rounds. It's not hard. So it's not even like there's a ban on having more rounds. It's just you're not supposed to hunt. And oh, what do you know? People actually break those laws all the time. Like when people are poaching, they just don't follow rules like that because those rules don't actually do anything. The only people that follow them are law-abiding people who were never going to be any kind of danger or threat anyway.
So I'm the only person who's ever beat the NRA nationally. I beat them flat out twice. I'm the guy that got the Brady bill passed. That is the background check bill. I even had Democrats on the stage who voted against the Brady bill. It's wrong. The Constitution doesn't say anybody can own a weapon. It says only certain people can own weapons.
The Constitution doesn't say that at all. What the Constitution says about who can own guns is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That doesn't say anything about who can or can't own weapons, except that it says the people. People's everyone. There's nothing in there saying the people except such and such. The people besides these ones. No, it just says the people. I don't know where you're getting all this from. There's always some like liberal legal nerd that's like, oh, why don't you learn some jurisprudence and some history of the courts, who will come and say, when I say that, oh, well, the Second Amendment does say the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, they'll come and say stuff like that, and they'll try to act like, oh, no, that's not what it says. Well, no, that's what the courts have argued. The courts have argued that it can be limited. The courts have sought to limit it. The courts have not upheld that it is unlimited. That doesn't mean that's what it says, and that doesn't mean that's what was intended. Because you have to remember, this was written at a time when random civilians owned all the same stuff that the militaries did. Private citizens owned cannons. Private citizens owned whole warships at the time the Second Amendment was written. And contrary to popular belief, I'm just going to throw this out there. I'm sure I'll do a whole episode on this at some point. There were a lot more repeating firearms at the time than people have you believe. It was not just muskets. And the people who wrote the Second Amendment and framed the Constitution definitely knew that just with a few advancements in metallurgy and a few, more decades of technology, repeating firearms were going to become the norm. So, yeah, the Second Amendment does apply to everyone, and it is unlimited. Sorry.
If you are incapable of thinking, or you're mentally ill, you can't own a weapon. If you're a terrorist, you can't own a weapon. You shouldn't be able to own a weapon if you're an abuser, so on and so forth. There's never been a limit on who can own, that anybody can own a weapon, period.
Well, at one point, there was basically no limit on it, Joe. There have been many times throughout history where people could just own whatever weapons they wanted. And not that long ago in America, people could do the same thing. Most of what he said in the first part of that statement about if you're an abuser, if you're a terrorist, if you have... I don't know about the mental illness part. I don't know exactly how that looks statutorily. But for the most part, what he's saying is accurate. There are people that can't own guns. And personally, I disagree with that. I don't think that there should be anyone prohibited. I think that if you can be trusted enough to not be in jail, you should be allowed to own a gun. Because someone who is not in jail but can't be trusted, either A, they should still be in jail, or in the case of, truly heinous crimes like serious rapes or murder, they probably should have been put to death. If they're not in jail and they can't be trusted with a gun, they either should still be in jail, or if not, they're not going to listen to that law and they're going to get a gun or hurt somebody anyway if they want to. The only people who will actually follow that prohibition on having a gun as a felon are going to be people who you could trust with a gun anyway. People who really aren't a threat to begin with. Some white-collar criminal who never hurt anyone in the first place and would only have a gun for target shooting or home defense, he's going to be the one that might actually follow the rule, whereas the guy who went to jail for assaulting someone and hasn't reformed at all and, probably shouldn't have a gun, he's not going to listen to that law anyway, and he's going to get a gun if he wants one. So these prohibitions on, felons and whatnot are essentially completely arbitrary. And as far as like the domestic abuse thing goes, because that's one of the only misdemeanors that can prevent you from legally owning guns is misdemeanor domestic abuse. I get why people don't want a domestic abuser to have a gun, but let's be realistic here. Yes, a lot of women are murdered by their significant other with a firearm, but men don't need guns to hurt women. They just don't. Men are so much stronger that even if there were no guns, there would still be a lot of women being murdered by their significant other.
No, and by the way, those who say the tree of liberty is watered with the blood of patriots, a great line. Well, guess what? The fact is, if you're going to take on the government, you need an F-15 with Hellfire missiles. There's no way an AK-47 is going to take care of you if you're going to take on. You're worried about the government coming down, knocking down your door.
Oh, there's so much to unpack here. First of all, no wonder we are still wasting time and money and killing civilians and getting young American men killed in the Middle East when the people leading the country apparently have no idea how asymmetrical warfare works. This is a really common argument that liberals make. They'll say, oh, you think your AR-15 is going to take on the U.S. Army? And yeah, I think that's exactly what could happen. I mean, on one hand, the fact that you're making that argument means that you should actually support my right to own whatever I want. I should be able to own select fire AR-15. I should be able to own a belt-fed machine gun. I should be able to own explosives. I should be able to own all that stuff so that I can more effectively fight a tyrannical government if the need ever arises. But, thankfully, if that need ever does arise, I don't think the fact that civilians don't have a lot of machine guns and explosives and tanks, there are some, but not a lot. The fact that we don't have a lot of those in civilian hands, that's not going to mean we're screwed. Anyone who has ever been in the military or even, or honestly, even just thought too much about it or watched a movie should have more idea than Joe Biden apparently does how asymmetrical warfare works. When there is a more powerful side, like the U.S. military would be in a conflict and a potential boogaloo situation with the American civilian population, they can't exactly just blow everyone up. Even in the Middle East, the military isn't generally just going in and bombing everybody into submission. You can't do that. You have to, on some level, win hearts and minds, and it's very hard to fight an enemy that isn't a uniformed official military. You would have American insurgents fighting a guerrilla war against the United States military, not going against them in an open field and tank battles and dogfights. So, it's like, do they not understand that we'd be sabotaging things? We would be planting roadside bombs and blowing up military convoys. We would be shooting at them from rooftops and then disappearing into densely populated urban environments where they can't just drop a bomb. So it's not how it works. Third world goat herders with like rusty Cold War era technology have been a pretty big problem for some of the biggest superpowers in the world in the Middle East and also in Southeast Asia. You don't think that the most heavily armed, and America is the most heavily armed, and we have more guns than people. We own something like half of all the world's privately owned firearms. You don't think that the most heavily armed, well-equipped, wealthiest, well-trained civilian population that has ever existed in a country full of natural resources and mountains, you don't think that we could mount an effective resistance against the U.S. military? And that's without even getting into the fact that if anything like that started, there would probably be a fair number of people in the military who would defect to the other side. I mean, we saw that in the Civil War. Robert E. Lee should have been with the Union Army, but he went to the South because that's where Virginia went. It's not, I mean, and that was a general. That was a high-ranking officer in the military. You know, one special forces colonel decides he's going to take his group or whatever and just defect and go over to the side of the Boogaloo, and man, the U.S. military is hurting. Or one, lieutenant colonel in charge of an armored division. Like, we would probably get serious firepower and weapons on our side just from that. But even without that, there's a very realistic chance that a full-on, uprising style situation couldn't really be controlled by the government. There's just too many Americans who are well armed. Even if 1% of 1% of American gun owners fought back, I think that would be like 4,000 people. That's 1% of 1%. That's a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. You don't think that 4,000 people waging a guerrilla war against the United States would be a huge problem? You can't just level a city. Whenever people say things like, oh, well, the government has nukes, what are you going to do? I just laugh. It's like, well, I don't think the government's going to nuke a city, because the second the government nukes a city, now it's not 1% of 1% of gun owners who are fighting back. It's 90% of gun owners who are fighting back. And it wouldn't have to be nukes either. You'd bomb enough people, and eventually the entire civilian population is going to turn against you. So this is a terrible argument, and it's especially funny because they're constantly arguing that we don't need these weapons of war, but then apparently these weapons of war are completely ineffective at actually waging a war. Sure, okay.
And so it's bizarre. We never said you could own any weapon at all from the beginning. You can't own a machine gun. You can't own a bazooka. You can't own an M1 tank, no matter how much money you have.
Actually, if you have a lot of money, you can own those things. Machine guns are heavily regulated, but if you can pay the $20,000 or so or more to get one, less for some models, but for, like bigger belt-fed machine guns and stuff, you're definitely looking at paying tens and tens of thousands of dollars. If you can pay that much money to find a pre-1986 machine gun, and you can wait several months for it to go through, and you can, pass all the background checks and pay a $200 tax stamp, you can actually definitely own a machine gun. You can also own a tank. A lot easier, you can own a tank. I think a tank's essentially completely unregulated. It's just a vehicle. It's the munitions that would be highly regulated. And even then, you can get them if you have enough money. So no, Joe, you can own all those things. And lots of money is basically exactly what you need to own all those things. And again, actually in the beginning, it was pretty much completely unregulated. None of those things you just listed off were banned at all until 1934, when the National Firearms Act was passed. So you should really do some more research before you make these stupid statements.
You can limit the kind of weapons that are able to be owned. And so I think, and by the way, all the work I've done on this, including in our administration, I now have over 58% of the NRA members acknowledging you can't own an assault weapon. There's no need for it. You can't have...
I couldn't find the exact statistic he was quoting here. I searched 58% of NRA members, assault weapons. I probably could have looked a little harder, but I couldn't find it right off the bat. But honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if that was true. A lot of the NRA are FUDs.
I'm hunting wabbits. Ow, you're hurting me.
And if you don't know what a FUD is basically someone who says they're pro-gun, but when you start talking to them, they're basically like, oh, well, why would you need an AR-15? You don't need that for hunting. And really all they care about are hunting guns and like revolvers and stuff, which I love those guns, but that's certainly not all I care about. So a lot of the NRA are FUDs. And in the past, the NRA has been a very FUDish organization. They still sometimes exhibit FUD tendencies as an institution. They didn't really do anything about Obama's bump stock ban. There's been a few times, like when Philando Castile got murdered as a law-abiding concealed carry permit holder. He got murdered in, where was that, Minnesota, or wherever that happened. They didn't really do anything about the cops that murdered him. They didn't, go in a legal battle. They didn't hardly say anything. Again, Colion Noir might have, but he's kind of a semi-unofficial spokesperson for them. So the NRA as an institution didn't do anything. So the NRA has some problems. They've definitely gotten better in the last few decades than they were in like the mid 20th century, when they were half the time authoring gun legislation and being full retard fuds. But yeah, the fact that you can get a bunch of NRA members to say they want assault weapons banned doesn't mean anything for a number of reasons. First of all, democracy is not a moral system of government. So the fact that the majority supports something doesn't make it right. At one point, the majority of the country supported slavery. That didn't make it right. The rights of minority groups need to be protected. Everyone has a right to life, liberty, and property. And at this point, gun owners are a minority group. And so if 99% of the country said we shouldn't be able to own AR-15s, that wouldn't make it right to take my AR-15 away. It would still be wrong. So there's that aspect of this. The democracy is just not moral, and might doesn't make right. So I don't really care if the majority's on your side. You are still wrong. But more than that, I don't think that the numbers are as disparate as they would have you believe. Gun grabbers will always say things like, 90% of people support universal background checks. What I want to know, and I would love to, if I had some funding, actually conduct a study of my own, I would love to find out what exactly are people being asked, because you can really lead people with questions and you can get responses from them that you're looking for based on how you ask the question. And what I mean by that is this. If you went up to a random person, there's not a very high chance you're going to talk to a gun rights absolutist like myself. If you ask me, should there be any kind of law regulating gun? No, that's going to be my answer immediately. I'll just shut you down right then. And I will actually give the consistent, principled pro-gun answer. But a lot of people, if you say, do you think there should be background checks for guns? They're just thinking about when they go to the store. Now, I don't think there should be mandated background checks at stores, but most people have dealt with that so long, it's so part of the status quo for them. They're like, oh yeah, that's fine. Yeah, there should be background checks. And they aren't fully thinking through the ramifications of what truly universal background checks means. If you rephrase that question and you said, do you think that it would be just to throw you in a cage because you gave your cousin a shotgun for Christmas without running a background check first? They'd be like, what the hell? No, of course not. That would be terrible. And yet, I basically just asked the same question two different ways. One, I asked it in a way where people won't really think about it. And they'll just think, oh, well, this is the status quo. Yeah, that's fine. And then I asked it in a way that would really personally affect them and show the ramifications of universal background checks. You could ask an even more leading version of that question and say, do you think that background checks should be done to prevent criminals from owning guns? And they would say, oh, yeah, of course, I don't want a criminal to have a gun. But again, should there be background checks to stop a criminal from owning a gun is ultimately the same question as, should someone be thrown in a cage for giving a gun to their cousin? I think that if you ask those questions, you would get very, very different answers from people. And it would be really interesting to see how inconsistent they are. And while I obviously have not conducted this study, and I haven't been able to find anyone else who did either, I think it's safe to say that the number of people who would oppose universal background checks would go up significantly if a poll asked them questions along the lines of the ones that I'm outlining here. So yeah, 58% doesn't really matter either way, but I think that number is deceptive.
You can't have a magazine that has more than 10 rounds in it. And I'll do it again, because here's what happens. Talk about moral depravity. These beautiful young kids that are here, and I hope I'm not saying too much with them here, but these kids that are here, when you sent those children to school in kindergarten or first grade this year, second, third, fourth grade, what's the first thing they learned to do? Well, it used to be, when we were worried about fires in schools, is drop, roll, and cover. Now it's duck and cover. Literally, train to duck and cover. Run down the hallway zigzagging. Talk about loss of a soul. Why? Because we're unwilling to have a rational policy. It says you cannot have 20, 30, 40, 50 clips in a weapon.
50 clips in a weapon, huh? Okay. These guys can never keep their terminology straight. Even if he'd said magazines, that wouldn't make any sense. You're going to have a hard time finding very many guns that'll take more than one magazine at a time, Joe. Why don't we just stop scaring kids? You know, Joe, you should know all about this. When you were a kid, I'm sure you were taught to duck and cover from Russian attacks, even though hiding under a desk was never going to do much to save you in the event of a nuclear attack. And frankly, the chance of a nuclear attack in any given small town in America was not terribly high, and obviously did not happen. If you're worried about kids being scared and losing their soul or losing their childhood, or however you want to frame that, why do you continue to have them do these drills for an event that just is statistically unlikely to happen? Like, super, super, super unlikely. One of the videos that I'm going to have coming up soon, I'm putting a lot of work into putting it together and making sure that it's as good as possible, is about how school buses are more dangerous than firearms. I won't give you all the statistics right now, but suffice to say, school shootings are extremely rare. From 2007 to 2016, I believe there were 38 K through 12 aged children who were murdered at school. And over half of those happened at one school shooting in Sandy Hook. It's just insanely unlikely. I think I calculated it at the likelihood of any one student dying in a shooting. And remember, or being murdered in a shooting. Remember, this also includes a lot of like gang-related shootings that are settled at schools, is something like 1 in 1.4 million. And that's throughout their entire 12 years at school, K through 12, 13 years, I guess. It's super unlikely. It's so unlikely that one of the statistics I calculated is that riding a school bus, every minute you spend on a school bus is 27 times more dangerous than the risk of a school shooting is. And I'll show you exactly how I get to that number when I make this video and release it. But this is not a real problem. In the same time that in the same decade, 2007 and 2016, that around 38 students were murdered at school, around 40,000 died in car accidents. That's insane. Why are we worrying about this? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because shootings make the news and make national news. If a school gets shot up anywhere, even if only one person dies, it generally makes national news. If 2, 3, 4 or more people die, it's a huge news story that dominates the news cycle for a couple days. If 4 kids die in a car accident, that never becomes anything but a sad local story. It's just, people view it as so much more tragic when kids die in shootings. It's so much more sensational. It's all we hear about. And it's really scaring kids. That it's not, it's not really the fault of the kids that they're scared, but the adults around them are really failing them when they let them be scared about these things, and they encourage it, and they have them do things like these drills. You know what? If a school is really worried about the potential for a mass shooting, why don't they get some volunteer teachers who are willing to seriously train and carry a gun at all times? Oh, people always poo-poo at that idea and act like it can't work. Oh, it's so ridiculous. Well, like I said earlier, over half of the children murdered, K through 12 students murdered at school from 2007 to 2016 happened at Sandy Hook. 20 of the 38 students murdered in that decade were at Sandy Hook. That shooting lasted 6 minutes. Do you really think that a teacher with the tactical advantage of being on the hunt against the assailant, meaning they have the surprise and could potentially flank him, especially since they can hear the gunfire and they know where they are, they know the terrain, they know the school, and they have, unlike the shooter who's just wantonly murdering people, they have an emotional investment in protecting these children. You're telling me that a moderately competent teacher with a handgun couldn't have put an end to that a lot sooner? It took 6 minutes for Adam Lanza to kill himself, and he killed himself when people with guns showed any resistance. When the cops showed up, he blew his brains out. You mean to tell me that a teacher couldn't have moved his way across the school? I mean, certainly there still would have been a few children that died, but that shooting would have been cut a lot shorter if someone had a gun. So, yeah, what you're teaching, you're scaring kids, and then what you're teaching is just completely ineffective. Oh, wow. Like, lock the classroom doors. I mean, isn't that the most logical thing to do anyway if you can't just get out and really flee? So what are you even teaching them? What are you doing besides scaring them? I think with a lot of these people, scaring them is actually the end game. They just want to scare them so that their parents will vote against guns, because people at the high levels, the high echelons of the political sphere, they don't want armed populace because it makes us much harder to control.
I visited all those parents, literally, all those parents up in Connecticut when those kids were killed. And I visited every mass shooting. And guess what? What's left behind is devastating. Devastating. Not just the loss of life, which is horrible. Nothing worse than losing a child. But in addition to that, the psychological damage that's done. These kids, the single greatest concern people have, the Generation Z, they call it, 7 to 17 years old. The single greatest concern they have? Literally. Rated by the Harvard Institute, it's on a scale to 1 to 5, 5 being extreme, getting shot in school.
Well, like I just said, that's not a real fear. Joe Biden's ability to pull weird statistics out of nowhere, and maybe they're not coming out of nowhere, but the way he quotes them, they sound so nonsensical that they may as well be coming out of nowhere. I mean, I tried to Google this Harvard Institute thing he was talking about. He said something wrong because I couldn't find it. It just cracks me up.
And every single day in America, there's a mass shooting that occurs on our streets in our cities, in tough neighborhoods, that we don't even talk about. And so much of it can be prevented. So much.
Wow. This is just flat out not true. Or at least there are so many caveats that go into this that it may as well just be outright not true. There's only a mass shooting every day in America if you are counting incidents where no one dies. And, I guess that is, by some definitions, a mass shooting. Multiple people are getting shot. But it's not what people are scared of. When people hear there's a mass shooting every day, they're thinking, wow, there's a Columbine, there's a Sandy Hook, there's a Parkland every day. No, there's maybe 1 or 2 of those a year. There's not a mass shooting like that every day. Sure, there's multiple people getting shot almost every day in America in one incident. Multiple people getting shot. Obviously, there are multiple people getting shot in America every day, but you know what I mean. But basically, all of those shootings are gang related. I mean, I've talked before on here about how it's hard to figure out how many murders are gang related, but it's a significant number of them. It's got to be an even higher percentage of these mass shootings that are, mass shootings where no one dies, that are gang related. If you look at where they're happening, because there's places that track these, They're always like just gang-riddled cities like Chicago or LA, and you're just like, oh gosh, I wonder what went down there. Obviously some kind of gang violence where people are spraying bullets at each other and multiple people get hit. And on one hand, Biden is right when he says that a lot of this is preventable. But as I outlined in my episode about Bloomberg's ridiculous anti-gun Super Bowl ad, the best way to combat gang-related violence would be to end the war on drugs. And yet I don't really hear old Papa Joe pushing for anything like that. I don't hear him pushing for a total end of the war on drugs. I'm sure he wouldn't. He's like a retarded old boomer grandpa who doesn't seem to have very many deep thoughts. But that's how you would end that kind of violence, is by getting rid of the drug black market that fuels a lot of that gang violence.
And I'll say one last thing that's critical. I was one of those guys hollering we should go after the drug companies on the opioid crisis. We not only should go after them, we should put in some of the CEOs in jail, not just in jail. Because they know, for example, fentanyl can be addictive in 5 days. You ever see that advertised on television? You ever see when they're advertising these drugs? Well, guess what? Imagine if we couldn't sue them. They had an exemption. They couldn't be sued. Well, that's the exact exemption we've given gun manufacturers. All the havoc they have caused, you cannot sue them. The only major industry in America given an exemption voted for by the Congress, signed by a Republican president, saying you cannot sue them.
This is factually inaccurate on a number of levels. First of all, you can absolutely sue gun manufacturers. You just can't sue them for things that they didn't do. What Biden is talking about here is that there is legislation that has been enacted that makes it impossible to, or at least protects gun manufacturers from lawsuits stemming from crimes committed with their weapons, which is a perfectly sensible thing. I don't know if protections like that exist for other industries, but it wouldn't surprise me if they do. You know, should you really be able to sue, say, Colt, who makes AR-15s, for someone getting a Colt rifle, which they bought from, so far removed from Colt. Colt worked with a distributor. The distributor sent it to a store. The store sold it to someone, and then who knows what happened after that. Should Colt really be able to be sued and held liable for what someone did with that weapon, for someone murdering people? No, of course not. Just like you can't sue alcohol manufacturers. And like I said, I don't know if there's these protections there, but even if there aren't, there's no way a lawsuit like this would be successful. You can't sue alcohol manufacturers, breweries, distilleries, whatever, for someone getting drunk and getting in a drunken bar fight and killing someone, or drinking and driving. You can't sue car manufacturers because someone took their car and plowed it into a crowd of people. None of those lawsuits would ever succeed, and it wouldn't surprise me one bit if there were laws that protected them. I should look that up sometime, but I didn't have time before this video. However, I know for a fact that you can sue gun manufacturers. You can sue gun manufacturers if they sell you a defective product. There were a lot of lawsuits against SIG when they put out guns that were just not drop safe. It was one of the few times where a modern handgun was not drop safe and it could go off by being bumped or dropped or whatever. They got sued for that. And I'm sure they had to pay some fairly big settlements because they failed at their job. They didn't provide a safe gun. And part of buying a gun from a gun manufacturer, there's sort of an implicit contract there that the gun they're going to sell you works and won't blow up in your hand or go off randomly. So no, it's not that you can't sue gun manufacturers at all. You absolutely can. If a gun manufacturer sold you a gun that was defective and it blew your hand off when it exploded, you could sue them for that, and you would almost certainly win. And if they'd sold a gun that a lot of guns that were knowingly defective and a whole lot of people were affected by that, there could be a class action lawsuit against them. They are not immune to lawsuits. You just can't sue them for things that they didn't do. Should you be able to sell the manufacturer or sue the manufacturer of a knife for selling a knife that was eventually, years later after it was sold, used to stab somebody? No, of course you shouldn't be able to. That's retarded.
How many thousands of lives have been lost? Thousands of lives have been lost in the last 15 years to gun violence in America. And you know, by the way, you know what the single greatest cause of death from a gun is? Suicide. Suicide.
There it is. For once he's
And
honest.
so, folks, I'm going to change that law. I'm going to work like heck to make sure that gets changed. Because one thing to get their attention is say, I'm going to hold you responsible for the carnage you're keeping. Sir, you had a question.
What law are you going to change that will prevent suicide, Joe? I mean, I do like that you're being honest here. That's good. That is true. Something like 2/3 of all gun deaths that people are constantly talking about in gun-grabbing circles are really just suicides. And acting like they're gun deaths and that they were enabled by a gun is just so disingenuous. I mean, what law is possibly going to limit that short of getting rid of all guns? In which case, sure, if you got rid of all guns, there wouldn't be very many gun suicides. But would that really prevent people from committing suicide? Japan has almost no privately owned firearms, and their suicide rate is something like twice ours. If it's not double America's, it's pretty close to it. Significantly higher. There's a number of countries with significantly higher suicide rates than America. Because the things that drive a person to commit suicide are not access to guns. It's a whole host of personal and emotional factors. But people might say, oh, well, a gun makes it much easier to kill yourself quickly and efficiently, and it makes it harder for you to survive the attempt. Okay, but again, what laws are going to change that? A magazine ban? Believe it or not, people don't need a 30-round magazine clip or whatever you want to call it to off themselves. They just don't. You need one bullet. A ban on certain calibers. You want to ban, a 5.56 round that you guys are always so scared of because that's the AR-15 shoots. Okay, well, I mean, you can kill yourself with a .22 long rifle very, very easily. In fact, I've known people that kill themselves with a .22 long rifle. So that wouldn't change anything. A waiting period. So someone can't just go buy a gun and then shoot themselves with it 20 minutes later, right when they get out of the store. They have to wait. Well, okay, but I would assume that most gun owners who commit suicide using one of their guns have probably owned that gun for a long time. Oh, background checks. Oh, wait. Most people who commit suicide aren't criminals because most people aren't criminals and have no criminal records. So background checks wouldn't prevent them from getting a gun. Oh, assault weapons ban. Oh, wait. Most people commit suicide with handguns. But frankly, literally any gun will do if you really want to get the job done. So yeah, what law would possibly affect the suicide rate? None. There isn't one. And I think that this shows two things. One, these people have no idea what they're talking about. They haven't thought this through. And they don't know anything about guns. But two, ultimately, they don't want to just put a few little controls in there and limit your magazine capacity. Ultimately, they want to virtually eliminate firearms from society. They don't want anyone to be able to have them. They just want a disarmed population, and they'll use any ridiculous excuse they can to get to it. Anyway, guys, Biden is a truly retarded person. Not that we should have expected anything else from a guy who has given people advice that may or may not have led to some people getting shot and killed.
If you want to protect yourself, get a double-barrel shotgun. Walk out on the balcony here, or walk out, put that double-barrel shotgun and fire 2 blasts outside the house. I promise you, whoever's ever coming in is not going to. You don't need an AR-15.
He claims self-defense, but tonight Theodore Wafer is charged with second-degree murder in the death of Renisha McBride.
The 54-year-old admits he opened fire on the young woman on his front porch in Dearborn Heights.
So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you thought it was funny and humorous. I'm sure I will be back with many, many more looks at the anti-gun rhetoric of the 2020 Democratic candidates. And maybe some from the 2020 Republican candidate, if you catch my drift. But for now, that's all I've got. I will be back hopefully in the next week. My birthday's next weekend, so I'd like to get another episode in before that so I can have fun on the weekend and not have to worry about doing an episode. So hopefully I'll be able to get something out this week, but we'll see. I'm still finishing up my remodel, and I've got some more work to do. So anyway, guys, take care and have a good week.